Most men spend their entire lives performing. For their boss, their friends, their family. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask you wear so the world accepts you. And here's the brutal part: the man everyone loves? He's usually the most imprisoned one in the room. The lone wolf they call antisocial, difficult, a loner? He stopped performing years ago. And that's exactly why he's free. By the end of this video you'll understand exactly why the man who walks alone isn't broken or lost. He's operating from a psychological framework that most men never even discover. You'll have 3 concrete shifts you can apply this week to stop bleeding energy into relationships and roles that drain you. We live in a culture that pathologizes solitude. If you're not networking, collaborating, posting your life online, something's wrong with you. Men are medicated, coached, and shamed into sociability. But the data doesn't lie. Rates of male loneliness are at an all-time high even as men have never been more socially connected. The mask isn't working. And the cost of wearing it isn't just exhaustion, it's the slow death of who you actually are. The lone wolf has already done the work most men avoid, individuating from the herd. Jung spent years after his split with Freud in near total isolation. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. He descended into his own psyche, documented his visions in the Red Book, and emerged with a framework for the human mind that still shapes psychology today. He didn't retreat because he failed socially, he retreated because the real work required silence. Nietzsche did the same in the Swiss Alps. Tolstoy withdrew to Yasnaya Polyana and wrote War and Peace. These weren't failures of connection. They were strategic withdrawals towards something deeper. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong work of integrating your shadow, your unconscious drives, your authentic self, into one coherent person. Here's the mechanism: social performance actively blocks individuation. When you're constantly adapting to what others expect, you never hear the signal underneath the noise. The lone wolf, by choosing solitude, creates the conditions where that signal finally comes through. He's not running from people. He's running toward himself. Solitude is where the shadow gets integrated, not suppressed. Think about the guy who's always the life of the party, always agreeable, always on. What happens when that man's wife leaves him, or he loses his job? He collapses. Because his entire identity was outsourced to the group. He never sat with his own darkness long enough to know it. Compare that to Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, surrounded by a million demands, yet he wrote the Meditations in private, wrestling with his own ego, his anger, his mortality. He knew his shadow. That's why he could lead without being consumed by power. Jung's shadow is everything you've disowned about yourself: the rage, the ambition, the grief, the hunger. When you never face it, it runs you from underneath. You project it onto enemies, partners, co-workers. But the man who spends real time alone, who journals, who sits in discomfort, who doesn't immediately reach for his phone, he meets his shadow face to face. And paradoxically, once you know your darkness, it stops controlling you. Solitude is the only arena where that integration happens. The lone wolf sets terms, he doesn't negotiate his core self for acceptance. Kierkegaard refused to marry Regine Olsen even though he loved her, because he knew his purpose required a kind of solitude she couldn't share. Epictetus, born a slave, maintained an inner citadel no master could touch. In both cases, the refusal wasn't coldness, it was clarity. They had drawn a line between what was theirs and what wasn't. Modern equivalent: the man who declines the promotion that would compromise his health, or who walks away from a friend group that requires him to be someone he's not. Not from weakness. From a settled knowledge of what he's built inside. Psychologically, this is boundary function rooted in self-concept clarity. Men with poorly defined identities are highly susceptible to social pressure. They need the group's validation to know who they are. The man who's spent time alone has tested his values against himself, not the crowd. His self-concept is load-bearing. External rejection doesn't collapse it. This is what looks like arrogance from the outside, but inside it's just stability. Extended solitude builds a tolerance for uncertainty that social dependency destroys. Viktor Frankl, imprisoned in Auschwitz, said the last human freedom was the ability to choose one's attitude toward any situation. He survived partly because he had a rich inner world that couldn't be taken from him. Camus wrote The Stranger and the Myth of Sisyphus while Europe was burning. He sat with the absurd and built something from it. The lone wolf, through repeated exposure to his own company, develops what psychologists now call distress tolerance. He's not numb, he's trained. Social dependency functions like an emotional prosthetic. The more you rely on others to regulate your mood, your sense of worth, your decisions, the less capacity you develop to self-regulate. Solitude, practiced deliberately, works like interval training for the nervous system. You sit with boredom, with discomfort, with silence, and your window of tolerance expands. Over time, you can hold uncertainty, rejection, failure, without immediately outsourcing your reaction to the nearest person. That's not coldness. That's emotional sovereignty. The lone wolf's relationships are higher quality precisely because they're chosen, not required. Schopenhauer compared human social life to porcupines in winter. We huddle for warmth, but we also spike each other. He wasn't anti-relationship. He was anti-compulsory connection. The man who chooses solitude as default and relationship as exception doesn't settle. He brings his whole self to the few people he does let in, because he's not starving for validation. He's full. Compare that to the man who maintains 40 shallow friendships because being alone terrifies him. He's never fully present in any of them. Attachment theory frames this as secure attachment developed through self-sufficiency rather than anxious attachment developed through constant external seeking. When your baseline need is met internally, you enter relationships from abundance rather than scarcity. You can tolerate conflict without panicking. You can walk away from what's toxic without catastrophizing. The lone wolf's inner life isn't a wall, it's a foundation. And relationships built on a foundation hold weight that ones built on need cannot. Here's what we covered. 1. Individuation. The deep psychological work of becoming yourself requires solitude. Performing for the crowd actively prevents it. 2. The shadow doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It runs you. The man who sits alone long enough meets his own darkness and stops being controlled by it. 3. Self-concept clarity. Knowing who you are independent of group validation is the source of the lone wolf's apparent control. He's not cold. He's grounded. That's the difference between isolation as wound and solitude as weapon. If this landed for you, if some part of you recognized that the solitude you've been told to fix is actually something worth understanding, subscribe. We drop one of these every Tuesday and Friday. No filler, no motivational fluff. Just the philosophy that actually explains why men are built the way they are, and what to do with it.